Well, good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. If we've not met before, if you're new with us or a guest this morning, my name's David Black. I'm the campus pastor here, and so glad you could be with us on this fall/summer day. And then hopefully it won't be winter at all, ever again. But hope that you are here and that you've already met somebody that you may not have known before, or maybe even just heard something that encourages you. We say this often, and we do mean it, that following Jesus in our day and age is costly, and it will get more costly. But that doesn't mean that it has to be lonely. And so our hope for you is if you know Jesus, if you say you follow him, that you come in and immediately see that you're not by yourself, and that you are encouraged by someone else here, that you hear from God. If you don't know Jesus, if you're exploring Jesus, if you've got questions about Jesus, our hope is that at the very least, and by least we mean like the bottom line, the very least that you would find a group of people in which you could ask those questions and explore Jesus with them. It's not an easy decision to follow Jesus. It's not a casual decision. It's not just adding something. So following Jesus isn't adding something to your life. You don't add Jesus to your life. It's not even just agreeing with his principles. It's actually saying, you're in charge, and I'm going to literally follow you. And so as you're doing that and exploring that, again, don't do it alone. So thanks for putting us as another voice in the midst of that conversation. Quickly, before I jump into our series, today we're starting a new series, so you picked a great time to come. If you're just, again, joining us, or if you just come back for a little while, great time to come. I'm excited about where we're headed. But before we talk about that, I want to give you a heads up about next week. Next week is the first Sunday of the month, and as is our custom now, it's become a custom, on the first Sunday of the month, when they have caffeine and octane, it's very difficult for us because of the event at the mall to have what we're doing right now. You wouldn't be able to hear one another, sing one another, do any of that. So we have a meeting typically in the evening at 4:30. So next week we have our fall communion service, and so we'd invite you to come to that. We'll share a meal, bring chili or soup. That's how it works. And then we actually go through the things that Jesus did the night before he died on the cross to remember what he did for us together. So we share a meal. We wash feet. We don't make you do that, but if you're interested in what is that about and why would we do that, you're more than welcome to come and observe or participate. And then we do share a bread and a cup. And so that's next week at 4:30. If you have a workshop scheduled for next week, they take place an hour before, just like it would be at normally in the morning. So we're going to meet at 3 o'clock, actually. 3 o'clock if we have a workshop next week for basic beliefs. So that's my commercial for it. Again, it's not something we do in place of having a service. It is just a different type of worship service together, and one that we've come to love as a group and a community. So we are in the beginning of a series. Sometimes we walk through topics, like last time we went through a series we just finished with Shelf Life of Self. We just talked about how we weren't the best to own our life, and we are now starting a different type of series entitled just Ruth. And it is a series in which we are looking and walking through an entire book of the Bible. And so we are looking at the book of Ruth for the next 4 weeks. So we're going to take it chapter by chapter. You're going, we're going to do a whole chapter every week? Yes. Ruth is a narrative, which means that it's a story or it's written in a story form. It actually happened, but it's written down for us, and it's told to us in a very specific way for a very specific purpose. And so if you're looking at this every week, what that means is when we finish, it will not give you closure. So if you're looking for things to wrap up nicely in a nice bow this morning, it'll be like a week or 2 week long commercial break between every week before we get to the next one. Also, I would say for some of us, maybe you grew up in church, and so you're going, oh, I know Ruth. I know what it's about. I've heard it before. Well, our hope and prayer is that you hear from God maybe anew in your current situation from that. And maybe you didn't grow up in church, and you're like, I don't know anything about Ruth. I don't know anything about Ruth. We wrote down as a subscript that Ruth is a harvest tale. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, it takes place at the time of harvest. So similar to the time that we're actually in right now. Ruth is a tale about a hard time, about hard times, and finding God in the midst of it. Ruth is a tale about loss and it is a tale about love. It is a tale of regret, and it is a tale of redemption. It is a tale of discovery and difficulty, and it is a tale of possibility. And it is a tale that is true. It's one in which we get to look at real people in real circumstances. And so what I'd like to do every week is we're going to read the passage together, and then we're going to zoom in on the passage. And again, this is a real life. So I'd encourage you to hear it and read it as real life and real people, not through rose-colored glasses. And when we zoom in, I would encourage you to find yourself, to look in the text and say, are these people, or maybe a combination of these people, who am I in this story? And how do these people relate to maybe real life to me today? So we're going to zoom in, we're going to find ourselves, and then what we're going to do together is zoom out and look at who God is. And so say, not only do we see real people, but they're in real life circumstances. And sometimes it's difficult in real life circumstances to remember who God is and see him. So we're going to zoom out and see him through that. And if you're here, you're going, well, what difference does a book that was written hundreds of years ago have for me today? Why does that even matter? I would say it matters to you because it's real life and real people. Ruth matters for people who are in the midst of difficulty, who life is dealt a difficult time to. Ruth matters if you're going, I'm going through a hard time right now, or I know someone who's going through a hard time, and it's not easy. Ruth matters if you feel like you're just going through the motions. If you feel like you're on autopilot, or maybe the news of this world and the events of the past month have made you numb, Ruth matters. Ruth matters if you're losing hope, if you feel it slipping away, if you feel like you had a hope in humanity or a hope in something else, and now whatever it is that you had as a foundation is beginning to crumble and erode. Ruth matters if you're literally looking around at the world and going, I don't know if anything that I do matters. I don't know if life is worth what I thought it was worth. As a parent, as a single person, as a wife, as a husband, as an employee, as just a person in this world, does anything really matter? And so I will just tell you from the get-go, as you probably are beginning to already find out a little bit by the tone in which we're talking, chapter 1 is not easy. It's not easy. In fact, Ruth chapter 1, which is where we will be today, and so you can turn there on your devices or on your scripture if you have it. Otherwise, it'll be on the screen. Ruth chapter 1, you could sum it up this way. Today, here's what we're talking about. It is real life with real problems in which real people respond when life gets really bad. In fact, it's the next slide right there on the click. Yeah, it's real life and real problems and how real people respond when life turns real bad. So I'm going to read the first 5 verses for you. We'll begin to talk our way through the story a little bit, and then we'll make some observations. But I just want to point out the first 5 verses that we're going to read take place over the course of 10 years. Okay, so we're just going to read through this, and we could easily just breeze right by and go, oh yeah, there's just a few things. But there's a wealth of information that we need to learn at the beginning of this conversation. And it's right here, 10 years in 5 verses. Let's read this together. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 Moabite wives, the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Again, don't read that tritely. It's real life. 10 years. Real difficulty. We learn a lot about our story just from those 5 verses. For example, we're told right out the beginning that it was written during the time of the judges. You say, well, what was that? Well, if you're a history buff, that's about 1500 BC. But Judges, if you're in the Bible, if you didn't grow up in church, Judges refers to a specific time in the life of the people of God, which was the nation of Israel, when there was no king. And all you have to do to figure out what was going on in the book of Judges is to literally turn back, if you had a paper Bible, 1 page and read the last verse of the end of the book of Judges, which is a history of what happened at that time. And this is what you find, the last verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I know we know nothing about that today, right? There was no king in Israel. Everybody just said, works for me. And they did it. Everyone looked at everyone else and said, you do you. And it's within this time, the book before, that this story about Ruth actually takes place, which is very fascinating. Someone wrote this, a commentator wrote this about the book of Judges. It says, it was like a prison riot plus spring break plus Mardi Gras. When you read Judges, you're like, yep, that's what it is. It's not pretty. Don't read it to your children before bed or before the age of 10, right? At that point. Because there's stuff in Judges you're like, I don't know what to do with that. Maybe we'll talk about it sometime. But for now, we're in the book of Ruth, and it's taking place at this point in time. We're also told, notice, that there was a famine in the land in the town of Bethlehem. Now, we're going to get to Bethlehem in a few months, right? At a time that we're remembering, oh yeah, something else happened in Bethlehem. Christmas happened in Bethlehem. But for right now, there was a famine in the land. In other words, not only is there a famine spiritually among the people, because everyone was doing whatever they did in their own eyes, but then there was also the difficulty that there was no food in the land of Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread. So literally, there is no bread in the house of bread. So things are not good. People are doing whatever they want. There's no food. And then we're told that a group of people decided to go to Moab. That there's a guy, so he took his family to Moab. Now, why is Moab important? Well, if you were to look back in Israel's history, you would find out that Moab had a history of attacking Israel as their enemy. Moab actually had a relationship to Israel that was pretty hostile. In fact, God would say this to his people when he wrote down the law for them in a book called Deuteronomy. He would say this. He said, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. That's pretty strong language. And if you were to look back further, you'd find that Moab and the people of Moab were actually descendants of a pretty sordid tale in Israel's history. In fact, now is the time when I would say, if you have a child here, we have a great Power Kids program, because where Moab came from a drunken romp of a guy named Lot and his children, his daughters. And they fathered 2 nations. One of them was Moab. And so you can imagine that somebody who's hostile to you, that didn't come from great breeding, literally, how they might think about that country and that nation. And they were told, actually by the Lord, to never go there. Their god was Chemosh, and they would sacrifice their children as babies and infants after birth to that god. And so that was part of the issue there. And like, don't go practice in their ways and their cultures, because they're going to lead you in a different direction. So the man named Elimelech, we find out his name's Elimelech. Why is that important? Well, Elimelech means God is my king. So God is my king went to live in the land of Moab. We're also told other couple of names there that are important. Naomi means sweet. We're told that Mahlon and Chilion, or their kids, their names mean sick and dying. How would you like to have a kid and go, we're naming you dying. We're naming you sickness. That gives us an idea into perhaps their physical health. That even from birth, there was something that was not quite right with their development or their health. And so we read in this story that for them, they went to this land, and over the course of 10 years, tragedy and trouble struck. Because over the course of 10 years, Elimelech dies, and now Naomi is living as a widow in a country that is not her people, so no relatives around, no family around, raising 2 sons alone. We're told that those 2 sons eventually marry Moabite women, and then they die. And this isn't like days of a social safety net, right? No Social Security, no extra stuff that we're applying for, no relatives to care for them, nobody's household for them to go into. And so we have 3 widows alone in a foreign country, in a famine, for 10 years, who have had great, great loss. Well, what do? Well, eventually, they hear that there is food in the house of bread again. And they begin to make their way back down after 10 years. Again, don't just read this through rose-colored glasses. We're going to find out that that Naomi's saying, my life's miserable. God's done some stuff to me. And let's see how this goes and unfolds. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughter-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. So they're making their way back home after 10 years. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to your own mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with me and the dead with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in your household of her husband. In other words, she's going, go get yourself new husbands. Go home. You don't need to come with me. I'm a widow. I'm old. I'm going home to a foreign land. You're not from there. You've never been there. Why would you leave and come with me? Go back to your mom's house. Wait and find another husband. Get on with your lives. Right? Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? And that would be a custom where if you had married into a family and your husband died, part of the way that they would protect you as somebody who didn't have a lot of power in that day and age, they would receive you into their family in another way. So she's saying, hey, if I was to give birth to kids today, you wouldn't have them. Turn back, my daughters, go your way. I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, and even if I should bear have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So they have this conversation. Says, go home. And Orpah's like, no. And Ruth is like, no. But she's like, listen, this makes a lot of sense. Why would you do this? Like, obviously, God's dealt bitterly with me, and it's hard for me, and it's hard for you, so just go back. And Orpah goes, okay. But Ruth, we're told, clung to her. The word clung there is the same word that we use, by the way, when we read about Genesis, when Adam met Eve and said, hey, the 2 shall become one flesh, this bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That's what Adam says to Eve. And says, for this reason, man will leave his mother and father and cling to his wife. That's the word there. That's why sometimes you'll hear these next verses read at a wedding. And Ruth said, Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Get out of here. Go. Don't follow me. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And then she swears an oath. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. She uses the personal name of God there, by the way. Some of your Bibles have that all caps. In other words, Israel's God. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. In other words, I'm not changing this person's mind. So I'll just drop it. So now you can imagine these two women, one a widow and a mom, the other a widow and a daughter-in-law, one an Israelite going home for the first time, one a Moabite going to a foreign country, leaving everything, and they are about to walk back into town. Can you imagine Ruth after 10 years, or Naomi after 10 years coming back with Ruth, a Moabitess, walking into town and everyone going, well, look what the cat drug in. Who's with you, Ruth? Or Naomi, who's that? Oh, this is Ruth, my daughter-in-law. Where's your husband? Where's your sons? What's the deal? Imagine the stares. Can you imagine the looks that she got? So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. I bet they were. And the women said to Naomi, is this Naomi? Is this her? You know, it's funny they asked that, but I bet she wore it on her face. They didn't know what happened. They may not have known what the last 10 years were in detail, but I bet they could see it. So much so that they say, is this Naomi? And then Naomi said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. She's going, I'm going down to the local government center. I'm going to change my name. Don't call me Naomi anymore. I got a new identity, a new name. Call me bitter. I went away full, for the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Don't call me that. Why would you call me that? If you knew what God did to me, if you knew the history of my life, you'd have different words for who I am. I do. Call me Mara. So Naomi returned, and Ruth, look how many times it says Moabite. Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's Ruth chapter 1. There's a lot there. A lot that is real. Ruth chapter 1, remember? What is it? This is real life. And it's real problems. And how real life and real people respond when life gets real bad or turns real bad. Some of you hear this, you're like, man, I don't have to imagine that because honestly, I've got a similar story. It might not have been 10 years, but maybe your similar story. You could recount how something went wrong or some difficulties happened or something happened to a friend of yours and you're walking with them through it and you would go back and say, yeah, this is what happened and now what do I do? Some of us, we watch people go through this. And what we learn and what we see, just like we see in this text, is that often how you respond to life, real life, when it turns real bad, has a lot to do with your future and what comes next. It can mean the difference between life and death. And so here's where we're going. Just want 3 responses. What are 3 responses that we could have and we see in this story when life turns real bad? I wrote this down. First response, I can compromise. I can compromise. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, life got very difficult, and a guy named Elimelech decided that he wanted to leave the people of God and go be with others. We see in verse 1 and 2 that he went to sojourn. The word sojourn there, no, next slide. The next, we went to sojourn there, means to go visit. So in other words, hey, we're going to go. Things are difficult. We're going to go to the other country of Moab, somewhere where we're not supposed to go, but we're just going to go visit there for a little while because we got to do something. I got to do something. Right here, there's no food and things are not great. Everybody's acting crazy. I'm going to the place we're not supposed to go, but we'll go there for a little while. And then we're told that they remained there for 10 years. He stayed a little bit longer than I think he intended, quite honestly. I'm not sure that he would have chosen, right, to go to Moab knowing I'm going to go die there and my sons are going to die there. Probably wouldn't have made that decision. But with the information that he had, he did what was best and seemed fitting to him, what, in his own eyes, which is we got to get out of here. I couldn't help but think about the Clash and the verse to their song, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Because it plays out maybe what was going on in his head and maybe what's gone on in your head when you encounter difficulty and you have a decision to make. It says, should I stay or should I go? Should I stay or should I go now? If I go, there will be trouble. And if I stay, it will be what? Double. So come on and let me know. Some of us, we've wrestled with that. We know that. We might have a decision to make and a choice to make and go, I know what God says, but if I say it feels like it's going to be double the problem. So what am I going to do? Should I stay or should I go? At some point, he did what was seemed right to him. Proverbs 14:12 talks about a life or an individual like this. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. I wonder if the author of Proverbs had Elimelech in mind when he wrote that. I wonder if he thought about the story of Ruth. Saying, when times get difficult, I have a choice to make, and the choice that I make might be, do I compromise or not? The fascinating thing is that the man's name was God is my king. And the man whose name is God is my king lived what? As if God was not his king. He said, I'm going to go to the land of Chemosh, where they worship him. I'm going to go over there because to me, the bread over there seems better than what I got here. And so I'm going to go and take my family there. Compromise, I wrote this down, compromise is lip service rather than life surrender. And so he's saying, yeah, God is my king. That would be his name. That's that first slide right there. If is lip service instead of life surrender. Saying, hey, God's my king. I get that. That's my name. But right now, right now, I got to do what I got to do. Even though I know what God said to do, I should not do, but now it actually seems more fitting for me to do. In other words, obedience, and when it comes to compromise, obedience is seen as an option. Someone wrote this quote, and I think it's great. Compromise is simply changing the question to fit the answer. In other words, I know what I want to do. I know what God says. I know what I'd like to choose, so I'm just going to change the question a little bit. Like, hey, I know that God says I should not be involved in blank, but I kind of need this to happen. So what if we just say, does it really matter right now? Like, hey, I know that this is a relationship that God's like, it's not going to work out well for you, and you shouldn't go that way. But they're a really nice person. And quite honestly, there's not a lot of people out there that we got to work with. And so if this is the best that I got right now, maybe it doesn't matter. I know that I should not participate in this behavior, but everyone else is doing it, and no one's going to really know, and who's going to blame me really, right? And who knows? Maybe it's God's will that I would do this, and somehow he's going to work it out. I could always ask for forgiveness anyway, because he's going to do it. He's going to forgive me. That's how that works, right? You see, that's lip service without actual life surrender. Someone wrote this, and I thought it was interesting, that Elimelech had his family's physical needs in his mind when he went to Moab. My kids need bread. They're starving. We can't stay here. But he neglected their spiritual needs. Never thinking like, what happens if I take my family to a different country who worships a different God and behaves in different ways? Who will they become? You see, compromise seems easier, but it's often deadlier. Elimelech, if he knew, right? Isn't that the way it always works? If you knew how it would end up, I would never have even picked up the phone. I would have never even said I would go. I would have never said what I said. I would have done what I've done. And just as a pastor, can I tell you, if my walls could talk in the office, which they can't, thank the Lord, the amount of people I have sat with who say, if I had only known, right? You know it because you have kids, you have friends, you have family members maybe, you see it, they don't. You're going, don't do that. And you're like, it's like a train wreck. It's like watching, people say, it's like watching a train wreck happen. It seems easier, but it all is often deadlier. And it often relies on going, hey, these are my intentions. God knows my intentions. They're good. But the actions are forgivable. So here's the issue. And I want you to hear this because I think oftentimes, especially in the South, it gets talked about like this. Well, don't you know that you're rebelling against God's rules? Which, I don't want to make light of that. God does have things that he said about life. But here's what I would say about compromise. Compromise is not just, the deal isn't that you're just ignoring God's rules. It's not just that you're rebelling against God's rules. You're actually just ignoring a relationship. You're ignoring a relationship. In other words, if I was to sit down with someone who knows Jesus and go, hey, do you believe that God knows everything? Yeah. Do you believe that he loves you? Yes. Do you believe that he has what's best for you? Yes. Do you trust him? Yes. Well, then help me understand how everything you just said, why aren't you agreeing with him in your life in this area? Can you help me understand that? You see, at some point, choosing a relationship with an individual might actually be ignoring the relationship with God. Acting in a certain way in business that's not 100% true, right? Might be ignoring a relationship. You're ignoring a relationship with God. You're saying, hey, in my marriage, I'm choosing this, and I'm ignoring the Lord. Or in my speech, I am choosing to speak like everybody else and ignore. I could just go down the list. It's not just rules. It's not just rules. It's saying there's someone who loves me, knows what's best for me, who I trust, and yet in this moment, I'd like to choose to be king. And here's the main thing. When we do that, oftentimes compromise is contagious. It's contagious. Look at what happens to his sons. Now, it says, these, Mahlon and Chilion, took Moabite wives. Now, that is the opposite of what the Lord told his people to do. Now, do you blame them? Well, you read the story and you go, well, no. What other wives were they supposed to get in Moab, right? But why are they in Moab in the first place? Well, because of their dad. And so Elimelech's compromise leads to his kids' compromise. And again, we wouldn't look at them and go, it's their fault 100%. No, they could have made that choice, absolutely. But they were definitely influenced in their decision-making by their dad's compromise. And the truth is that oftentimes there are other places in our life, right, where someone else's compromise might actually invite us to compromise. I said, we got to ask this question. How long will I continue in someone else's compromise? In other words, because my parents did X, or because my boss does blank, or because my friends they've compromised, and yet I choose to live in it still. It wasn't me who compromised in the first place, but because of the difficulty right now, or where my life is at, or if you knew what my bank account was, or if you knew who my friends were, I got no other people to hang out with. These are just the ones that are there, right? And so we just go on and go on and go on in somebody else's compromise. The right thing is always the harder thing. It always will be. I don't know if that's a principle that's written down somewhere, but I've yet to see it where it's easier. The right thing is always the harder thing to do in the moment. I think more than that, and perhaps the most important thing about compromise to note is that it leaves others vulnerable. It leaves others vulnerable. Look where they're left. So the woman was left with her two sons, without her two sons and her husband. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are all left because of somebody else's compromise. It could be that you're like them. In other words, you didn't compromise, your parents did. You didn't compromise, your last pastor or youth leader did. You didn't compromise, somebody else who had authority or opportunity, they compromised. And now you are the person who's left with the consequences. Their compromise was their issue, but now you got the consequences. Why is that an issue? That's because that's what happens. Compromise always leaves others vulnerable. Always does. And it could be that the issue with your compromise is not just simply yourself, but when we choose to interact in that way and we choose to embrace compromise, oftentimes somebody else bears the consequences. You see, that matters because what happens next in Naomi's life happens because of Elimelech's compromise. Yet she does have a choice. I can compromise when things get real bad. I can compromise. Or I can become bitter. Second one, I can become bitter. Here's Naomi. We're told in verse 20 when she came back, she said, she confesses it herself. She says, hey, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has been dealt very bitterly with me. You think about bitterness. I don't know what picture comes to your mind, but I was just thinking about it this week. I don't know if you know what a persimmon is. We're in the South and we have persimmon trees around. They're this orange fruit that grows, and it's edible. You can eat it. It's sweet. Deer like it. At some point, it ripens and looks like this. There's some in our neighborhood. But something interesting about the persimmon tree is this. Before it's ripe, it's very, very green and very, very hard. So this orange fruit's soft and supple and sweet. But this is the fruit before it ripens. And in it is a chemical called alum, A-L-U-M. If you've ever had a persimmon before it's ripe, alum, what it does is it absorbs moisture. That's its job. Sucks it up. So if you take a persimmon that's green, and if you just take your teeth and bite into it, you'll suck all the moisture out of your mouth. And you're talking like this. It's very difficult. It's a horrible experience, but every kid should have it. That's what I should say. It just sucks it out of there. It's very, very bitter. It's very bitter. And when I think about that, I think about Naomi and the issue of some of the difficulty in her life. And what bitterness does is it sucks all of the joy, gratitude, love, compassion, just takes it right out of your life. There's not enough moisture in your mouth for the alum that you're taking. There's not enough joy and hope and happiness in your life from the bitterness that just takes it out. In verse 13, look at what happens. She says this, would you therefore remain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it has been exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Some versions say, it is worse for me than you. That's what it says. Some of your versions have NIV. It's worse for me than you. I think when we become bitter, we begin to compare. We begin to look at other people's lives and we go, man, they have it better. Man, you don't know the difficulty that's hard for you. Let me tell you the difficulty that's hard for me. Nobody else has experienced what I've experienced. They've never had the loss or the fallout or the pain or the hurt. Bitterness begins to compare with other people. If you ever talk to a bitter person, mine's worse. Doesn't matter what you got, theirs is worse. I don't know what life is with you, but mine's worse. Let me tell you about my story. They don't even hear you, right? Because theirs is worse. In fact, we see that bitterness begins to blame. Look at the very next thing. It says, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Not because my stupid husband moved to Moab and took us from our people. Doesn't say anything about Elimelech or his choices, right? God did this to me. If God would have, God, why did you do this? Why did you take my husband? I don't hear that, right, as like a platitude. That's, why'd you take my sons? God, what have you got against me? I hear it all the time. It's the hardest question to answer. Why would God fill in the blank? Right? And as a pastor, sometimes you say, I don't know. But it's not because he doesn't love us. We know that because of Christ, but I don't know. By the way, some of us, the only believers we've ever met, are bitter. Think about that. These two daughters, the only believers that they would ever known. Naomi's the only Israelite that they've known, and their husbands, and their dad, father-in-law. And now they're left with the only Israelite, the only quote-unquote believer in their life, heading back to Moab, and she's bitter. Not only does bitterness do that, but it also blinds us to the hurt and the pain of other people. It's blind. Think about Ruth and Naomi and Orpah. All of them are widows, but Naomi's looking at Orpah and Ruth and going, it's really difficult for me. Not, hey, I know you've lost your sons or your husbands as well. Go back to your people. Go back to your false gods. Go back. Find pagan husbands. That will be better for you. Like, man, Naomi, thanks for sharing the gospel with your daughters-in-law. Like, thanks for, hey, come live with me in the land of Israel where God is king. And now there's food. Go back to your false gods. Go back to your life. Blind to their hurt, blind to their pain, blind to the opportunity that they have there. And eventually, if we're not careful, bitterness can become unbelief. Look at what she says. Notice I say can become unbelief. Doesn't always equal that. But look at what she says. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Now, she's not saying, hey, I don't believe in God anymore. It's not what we're talking about. See, I just don't believe that he has my best interest in mind anymore. I don't believe he's given me anything good. By the way, she's standing there with her Moabite daughter-in-law going, I left full and now I've got nothing. And you got to think Ruth's going, what am I? Thanks. Right? She's bitter. She's bitter. See, she came back. And what she essentially says is, Naomi is dead. Yeah, Elimelech died. Yeah, his sons died. By the way, I died too. Bitterness is often the death of the inside, right? I'm dead inside. I might have a heartbeat and I might have a pulse, but nothing else is living in there. There's an important story that she overlooks. Actually happens in Exodus, and what I think is interesting is that if she had remembered perhaps the story of the people of God, she might have looked at it a little bit differently. In Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through 26, they're wandering in the wilderness. They're not yet to the promised land. They've left Egypt. They're grumbling at Moses. They're thirsty. It says this, when they came to Marah, which was a brook, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw the log into the water, and it became sweet. Now, if you were to read that in Hebrew, you would see that it became Naomi. There's actually a story that uses these two names in the history of the people of God. Why does that matter? Because Ruth probably knew the story, and she was looking at the story. Yeah, I know that story, and I know that's what God did before for our people, but I'm not willing to apply that to me because I'm different. It's more difficult. Yeah, I know the truth, or I know the story, but not me, not me. You say, well, what are the other options? I can compromise, I can become bitter, and lastly, I can cling to hope. See, in Ruth, we see a Moabite woman whose only followers of God was a compromised guy and a bitter widow. The only followers of God they'd ever seen in her life. And yet, she looks and says yes, not to Naomi. Don't miss this. She's not just simply saying yes to Naomi. She's saying yes to God. Saying, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. I want to be in and with you and your God. She could have easily taken a look at her life, right? She could have looked around and said, it looks to me like God is saying no. Hey, here's my husband. Nope, they're gone. Here's my homeland. Nope, we're leaving there. Right? Could have easily said, God says every area of my life, God is saying no, so I'm going to say no to him. But she looks at that and says, I'm going to say yes to him in this instance. See, hope says yes to God when all of life says no. Hope is saying yes to God when everything else feels like a no right now. Now, you could probably hear this and go, well, that's great, that's platitudes, that's church talk, right? But don't read this as that. This isn't a meme, right? This isn't just some phrase. These are real people in real problems with real life being real bad. And in the midst of it, she decides to leave her whole life. You see, hope clings to the people of God. She doesn't know much, but she knows that she wants to be with God's people. One of the most difficult things to do in the midst of difficulty and trial and pain is to show up where people aren't experiencing it for themselves. Man, it's hard to show up to the people of God when you're going through stuff. Because everyone else had a great week and you didn't. And they're going to ask me how it was, and I don't want to lie to them. And I don't want to tell them how it was for them to not understand, right? I don't know if I want to go back to that place where everyone's got bread and nobody knows my story. I'm going to show up and they're going to look at me differently. And they're going to look at me like I'm something the cat drug in, and they're not, and I don't have their background, and I don't have their upbringing, and I don't have all the things that they have. And they're going to look at me and, oh my goodness. Listen, people I get most nervous about are those who isolate. Because when we isolate ourselves, man, lies grow in loneliness. That's the soil they grow in. We begin to believe lies. Compromise happens when we're apart from community. We don't always feel like we want to do that. In fact, Hebrews 10:13, the author of Hebrews says this to people who are going through suffering. It says this, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting the meeting together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. One of the reasons we show up on a Sunday is not because we have it all together. It's because we've all had different weeks and different experiences. And yeah, we might not have the solution to your issue, right? But that's not the point. The point is there is a God who is good, and sometimes I need someone else to tell me what's true when I don't believe it myself. Someone else, I need somebody else to sing for me, pray for me, to open the Bible because I'm not strong enough. I'm weak right now. Right? It's what a lot of what Steve talked about last week. Gloria Marshall wrote a book called Everyday Faithfulness. In it, she writes this about her own experience. She had an issue with a son that was injured and hurt. It says this, maybe. Nope, not populating. In it, she tells a story about not wanting to show up at church. She says this, that I wanted to stay at home and everyone wouldn't have blamed me for staying at home. And then she remembered Paul's call to weep with those who weep. I went, I shared, I wept. My church family gathered around us, laid hands on us, prayed over us, and wept with us. I was not guaranteed that their prayers would result in my son's healing, but they certainly would result in God's grace to us in this trial. The people of God are a resource. Hope clings to the people of God. I wrote this down. Hope acknowledges the presence of God. In the book of Ruth, there are no miracles. No miracles. Recorded, none. Ruth doesn't get a miracle. And yet, even in the midst of that, she acknowledges God's presence in the midst of it. Your God will be my God. Really, the one who Naomi just said, his hand's against me? Yeah, I'll take that God for 5,000, Alex. Right? Yeah, the God who killed my husbands, or our husbands. Yeah, she actually says, I believe that there's still something here. He's going to be my God, even in the midst of this. In Ruth, there's no audible voice of God. No one hears the voice of God. Right? Sometimes maybe we think, oh man, if I had a miracle or if I could hear God's voice, well then I would know. But listen, there's the felt presence of God, which everyone talks about. Man, I feel his presence. And then there's the promised presence of God, which isn't as flashy and no one feels it. And oftentimes we think that all that takes the most faith, and the most visible sign of faith is when we feel God's presence. Oh, they got real faith. No, man, faith is for when we don't feel it. And yet he's promised to be there. Ruth believes in the promised presence of God. And lastly, as the band comes up, hope surrenders to the plan of God. And she leaves her home. Everything that's familiar. In the most difficult time of her life, she leaves the land in which she grew up to choose to go to a foreign land where she's not known, by the way, where she's looked at shamefully, but she's banking on something, and I guarantee you it's not Naomi's attitude. Right? What's she banking on? She's banking on the Lord. She'd rather be with God away from home than at home without him. Think about that. In other words, I would rather follow him out of my comfort zone to a foreign place to be with him than to remain in what's comfortable and familiar and easy and be without him. That's what hope does. Listen, I can compromise. I can become bitter. I can cling to hope. Real people like you and me. Real life. Real problems. Sometimes it turns real hard. I wonder, which one are you this morning? You see, our story doesn't get super good yet. But I don't want to miss the opportunity in the moment to raise the question. All of us are struggling at some point with something. And all of us have a choice. I wonder, are you here and God's speaking to you and you're going, but it seems easier and I could just do this thing and I know what he said, but are you here and it happened again? Life is hard again and you can't remember the last time it became easy. And you look around and you look at everybody else smiling and you go, what's there to smile about? Mine's worse. Have you started to become bitter? I wonder, are you here and you're just clinging to hope? You're like, it took everything in me just to show up today. By the way, thanks. Thanks for coming. I'm going to pray. We're going to sing, and the song that we're going to sing really just talks about our need for the Lord. And I'd love for you to just take the moment and sing, if you can. Sing for somebody else, because maybe they can't. Or maybe, just maybe, sit in the moment or stand in the moment and allow the people of God and the Word of God to minister to you because you need hope. Let's pray. Father, we just ask this morning that we would take the story that seems so far away and yet at the same time is so close. Would we take it and zoom out from where we've seen ourselves to see you, to see what you did in Jesus, to see how you left your home to come to a foreign land. Lord, how you drank something bitter on the cross so that we might be able to drink the sweet grace of being part of your family. God, thanks for giving us one another, that we might rely on each other in this moment. God, ultimately, we need you. So we thank you that even though we may not be able to feel it or see it, we know that you promised to be here with us.